She's deaf. Worthless girl can't even hear a train whistle, the drunken father shouted to the laughing saloon, offering his daughter like a broken mule for sale. Men circled closer, tossing out jokes and cheap offers while the girl stared at the floor, silent as stone. Then a rugged mountain man named Elias Boone placed a single silver dollar on the bar. "I'll take her." The room exploded with laughter, until Elias stepped beside the girl and whispered softly, "You flinched when that glass broke. Deaf people don't do that." For the first time her eyes widened, because if Elias knew she could hear, then he also knew the deadly secret she'd overheard about her father. "She's deaf. Take her if you want." The drunken voice cracked across the saloon like a whip, and the laughter that followed rolled through the smoky room like thunder over dry hills. In the little mining town of Red Hollow, where the wind carried dust down Main Street and the nearest railroad stop sat nearly 40 miles away, men had seen a lot of strange things traded over a whiskey table: horses, rifles, even land claims, but a daughter was still rare enough to turn heads. The girl stood beside the man who had shouted, her hands folded quietly in front of her worn blue dress, eyes lowered toward the plank floor, as if the boards themselves had become more interesting than the crowd circling her. She did not protest. She did not speak. Most of the men assumed she couldn't. That was the story her father had been telling for years. Clara Whitmore, the deaf girl, worth less than a mule with a lame leg. He liked to say whenever the bottle was half empty and his temper started drifting like smoke. The lanterns hanging from the rafters threw long yellow light across the room, catching dust in the air and glinting off chipped whiskey glasses. Somewhere near the back wall a piano played a lazy tune, though the player had slowed enough to watch the scene unfolding near the bar. Harold Whitmore leaned heavily on the counter, swaying just a little as he grinned at the men gathered around him. His coat smelled like cheap liquor and cold wind. $50, he said, lifting a crooked finger as if conducting an auction. That's all she's worth. Girl can't hear thunder if it rolled right through town. A few men chuckled. One of them muttered something about needing a cook more than a wife. Another shrugged and took another sip of whiskey. But the girl never reacted. Not to the laughter. Not to the offers. Not even when a glass clinked loudly against the bar beside her elbow. She simply stood there, quiet and still, like a figure carved from pale wood. Outside, the winter night pressed against the saloon walls. Snow had started falling sometime after dusk, dusting the hitching posts along the street and coating the roofs of the few buildings Red Hollow could call a town. Most folks had already gone home, leaving the saloon the only place still glowing with lamplight. That was when the door creaked open. A gust of cold air drifted in first, carrying the smell of pine and mountain wind. Then a tall man stepped inside, brushing snow from the shoulders of a heavy canvas coat. He moved with the slow, steady confidence of someone used to long trails and lonely miles. The bartender looked up first. A couple of miners turned their heads next. The stranger paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the smoky light. His name was Elias Boone, though few in Red Hollow had seen him before. He lived high in the mountain timber, where the road narrowed to little more than a wagon track, and the nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away. Elias said nothing at first. He simply watched the room, watched the drunken father, watched the men laughing around the bar. And finally, he watched the girl. Something about her stillness seemed wrong to him. Not the quiet, that could be fear. Not the lowered eyes, that could be shame. It was the way her fingers tightened slightly when someone dropped a metal cup on the bar, a sharp little sound that rang across the room. A small movement, barely there. But Elias noticed. He stepped forward slowly, boots thudding once against the floorboards as the laughter continued. Harold Whitmore was still talking when Elias stopped beside the girl. The mountain man leaned down just enough for his voice to reach only one pair of ears. His whisper was calm, almost gentle. "I know you can hear." And for the briefest moment, Clara Whitmore forgot to pretend. For a moment Clara Whitmore forgot the rule that had kept her safe. For 3 long years. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly, the way a person reacts when a sudden thought crosses the mind. It lasted less than a second, but the tall man beside her had already seen it. Elias Boone straightened slowly, his eyes calm and steady as if he had simply confirmed something he suspected all along. Around them the saloon continued breathing its heavy mix of laughter, whiskey, and tobacco smoke. No one else had noticed the whisper or the tiny shift in the girl's posture. Harold Whitmore was still leaning over the bar, waving his empty glass and repeating the same tired jokes about his daughter as though they were worth another round of applause. Clara kept her head lowered, forcing her breathing back into the slow rhythm she had practiced for years. She had learned early that silence could be stronger than words. In Red Hollow, people spoke freely when they believed someone could not hear them. They revealed secrets in careless tones, thinking their voices were safe from judgment. That was how Clara had survived in a house where the walls were thin and the nights were long. She listened. She remembered. And she never answered. Elias Boone, however, had just stepped into a story he did not yet understand. He moved a few inches away from her, resting one hand on the edge of the bar as if considering a drink. The lantern light revealed a face shaped by wind and long days outdoors. Lines near his eyes told of someone who spent more time watching the horizon than speaking to crowds. When the bartender approached, Elias shook his head quietly. His attention remained on the room instead. Red Hollow was not a large town. A single dusty street, a handful of buildings, and hills that seemed to swallow the place every winter. But even a small town carried its own kind of noise. Boots scraping across wood floors, chairs shifting, cards sliding over a table in the back corner. And beneath all of it, the voice of Harold Whitmore continuing his loud performance for the crowd. "Girl cannot hear a thing," Harold repeated, tapping his knuckles against the bar for emphasis. You could fire a cannon outside, and she would not blink. Several men laughed again, though the joke had already grown tired. Clara felt the mountain man's gaze return to her for just a second. Not sharp, not accusing, simply observant. The kind of look a hunter gives the woods when he knows something is moving beyond the trees. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver coin. He placed it on the bar with a quiet metallic click that carried farther than expected. The sound made Clara's heart skip even though she did not allow her face to move. $1. That was all. Harold noticed it immediately. His eyes lit with the dull excitement of a man who believed fortune had suddenly stepped into the room. "You serious, stranger?" Harold asked, squinting through the haze of drink. Elias Boone nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I am." The laughter around the room rose again, louder this time, as if the entire saloon believed the moment was a joke worth stretching. But Clara understood something the others did not. The mountain man had not placed that coin for entertainment. He had placed it because he already knew the truth. And in a town built on careless talk and quiet secrets, the most dangerous thing a person could do was notice the one listener everyone else believed was deaf. The laughter inside the saloon rolled on for a few seconds longer, thick and careless, the kind of laughter that men use when they believe nothing in the room can challenge them. Harold Whitmore scooped up the silver coin between two fingers and held it close to the lantern light, turning it slowly as if expecting it to multiply in his hand. $1. The shine of it made his grin wider. "You mountain folk must be lonely," he said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "Paying $1 for a deaf girl who cannot even hear you call her name." Another round of chuckles drifted across the tables, but Elias Boone did not answer. He simply stood there with the patience of a man who had spent years listening to wind move through pine trees. The mountain man's eyes rested briefly on Clara again, and this time she understood something else in his silence. He was not mocking her father. He was studying the space between words. Clara kept her head lowered, letting her hair fall forward just enough to hide her eyes. The trick to pretending you cannot hear is not the silence. The trick is resisting the urge to react when the world suddenly becomes louder than expected. She had learned that lesson slowly, beginning on a winter night 3 years earlier when a careless conversation had changed everything she thought she knew about her own home. Since then she had practiced stillness like a skill. Stillness when people laughed. Stillness when they argued. Stillness when secrets slipped into the air like smoke. That stillness was protecting her now, but Elias Boone had already stepped around it. Harold dropped the silver coin into his pocket with a satisfied nod, clearly pleased with the small victory of being paid for something he believed worthless. "Fine then," he said, waving a loose hand toward Clara, as if she were a piece of worn furniture. "Take her. She does not cost much to feed. She barely talks, and she cannot complain because she does not hear a thing." A few men leaned back in their chairs, enjoying the spectacle. One of them muttered that the mountain man would regret the purchase by morning. Another suggested that Elias might be trading a quiet life in the woods for a silent shadow that followed him everywhere. The jokes drifted through the smoke while the piano player returned to tapping out a slow melody in the corner. Elias Boone finally moved. He stepped forward with the calm pace of someone who never rushed unless the mountains themselves demanded it. He stopped beside Clara and glanced toward the saloon door where a thin line of cold air slipped under the frame. Snow was still falling outside. The world beyond the saloon waited in quiet white darkness. Elias spoke in a normal tone now, loud enough for the room to hear, but gentle enough to avoid sounding like a command. "Come along," he said. The words floated through the smoky air and landed in the silence around Clara. Every man in the room watched her carefully, expecting no reaction. After all, the girl could not hear. But Clara Whitmore had heard every word. And now the smallest choice of her life waited in front of her. For 3 years, she had survived by pretending to be invisible. By morning, if she followed this stranger into the snow, the entire town of Red Hollow might discover that the quiet girl they ignored had been listening to them all along. For a long second, the entire saloon watched the girl who was supposed to hear nothing at all. The piano slowed again. A chair creaked somewhere near the wall. Clara Whitmore felt every sound pressed gently against her ears like a test she had practiced for years. The stranger had spoken clearly. "Come along." Simple words. Calm words. But they carried the weight of a door opening in a room she had believed locked forever. If she moved now, even slightly too quickly, someone might notice. If she hesitated too long, the moment would pass like so many chances before it. Clara lifted her head just a fraction, careful, slow, the way a person might react to a gesture rather than a voice. Her eyes settled on Elias Boone for the first time since he had entered the room. Up close he looked older than she first guessed, though not by years so much as by miles. The kind of miles that stretch through mountains where the nearest town sits half a day away by horse. His coat carried the faint scent of pine resin and cold wind. Snow had melted across the shoulders and darkened the fabric. Elias did not rush her. He simply waited with the quiet patience of a man who understood that the smallest step sometimes required the most courage. Around them the men of Red Hollow leaned forward, amused by what they believed was a meaningless command given to someone who could not hear it. Harold Whitmore waved a lazy hand toward the door, as if dismissing both of them from the room. "Go on then," he said loudly. "Lead her by the arm if you have to. She will not know where you are taking her anyway." A few chuckles followed. Clara let the sound wash past her without reaction. Then she did the one thing no one expected. She stepped forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one careful step toward the door. A ripple of surprise moved through the room, subtle but real. Some men glanced at each other as if wondering whether the deaf girl had somehow guessed the command. Harold frowned. His expression briefly puzzled before the drink smoothed the confusion away. "Lucky guess," he muttered. Elias Boone said nothing. He turned and walked toward the saloon door with the same steady pace he had carried since entering the building. Clara followed half a step. Behind him, her boots touching the floorboards with quiet certainty. Each step carried her closer to the cold night outside and farther from the smoky room, where she had spent most of her life pretending not to exist. When Elias pushed the door open, a rush of winter air swept through the saloon, carrying swirling flakes of snow into the lantern light. The street outside lay silent beneath a pale blanket that softened every roof and fence in town. Horses tied to the hitching rail stamped gently against the cold ground. The moment Clara crossed the threshold, the door closed behind them with a dull wooden thud. The noise of the saloon faded instantly, replaced by the quiet hush of falling snow. Elias walked a few steps down the boardwalk before stopping beneath the dim glow of a lantern nailed to the post outside. For the first time since they left the bar, he spoke again. His voice was calm and low, shaped more by the mountains than by towns. "You can stop pretending out here," he said softly. Clara Whitmore stood still in the drifting snow, the cold air brushing her cheeks, and slowly raised her eyes to meet his. For 3 years, she had hidden behind silence. Now a stranger who lived far beyond the hills had uncovered the secret in less than 5 minutes. Snow drifted quietly across the empty street of Red Hollow, settling on the wooden boardwalk and the hitching posts where 2 horses shifted their weight in the cold. The lantern above Elias Boone cast a dull circle of light that turned the falling flakes into slow-moving sparks. Clara Whitmore stood within that light, her breath rising in thin white clouds, her hands folded tightly in front of her coat. For a long moment, she did not speak. The habit of silence was not something that disappeared quickly. 3 years of pretending had carved deep paths in her mind, and even now the idea of answering a voice felt strange and dangerous. Elias Boone waited without moving. The mountains had taught him patience long before this night. Wind in the timber could take hours to reveal the direction of a storm, and a cautious deer might watch a clearing for half a day before stepping into the open. Compared to that, waiting for a frightened girl to speak was nothing. Clara finally drew a slow breath. Her voice, when it came, sounded soft from disuse, like a door that had not been opened in a long time. "How did you know?" The words hung in the cold air between them. Elias did not look surprised. He rested one hand lightly on the wooden post beside the lantern and glanced toward the saloon door behind them, where faint music and laughter still leaked through the walls. "People who cannot hear do not react to small sounds," he said calmly. Inside the saloon, someone dropped a tin cup on the bar. Your fingers moved before your eyes did. Clara felt a flicker of heat rise to her cheeks despite the freezing night. She had spent years perfecting her stillness, yet a stranger had uncovered the truth in less than a minute. That was only one thing, Elias continued quietly. There were others. Clara tilted her head slightly, curiosity pushing past the fear that had kept her silent for so long. Elias spoke in the steady tone of someone explaining the weather. When the door opened and the wind came in, you turned your head a little before the lantern moved. You heard the hinges before you saw the light shift. Clara stared at him. Those were details so small she had never imagined anyone would notice them. But the mountain man had. Elias Boone had spent most of his life watching the world closely because the mountains demanded it. A loose rock on a trail, the snap of a branch in deep woods, the distant echo of water beneath spring ice. A man who survived alone in that country learned to read tiny signs the way other men read newspapers. Clara lowered her gaze again, snow gathering lightly on the sleeves of her coat. "I had to pretend," she said quietly. "If people think you cannot hear them, they stop hiding things." Elias studied her for a moment, the lantern light reflecting faintly in his eyes. "That is a hard way to live." Clara gave a small, humorless smile. It was the only safe way. The wind moved softly through the empty street, carrying the faint smell of pine smoke from somewhere beyond the buildings. Elias glanced toward the dark road that climbed north out of town, disappearing into the hills where his cabin waited many miles away. Then he looked back at Clara Whitmore. The girl Red Hollow believed was deaf, standing alone under the lantern with snow falling gently around her. "You heard more than most people know?" he said quietly. Clara hesitated, her breath slowing again. She had heard many things during those silent years. Secrets whispered across tables. Plans spoken when the bottle loosened careless tongues. Things no one in Red Hollow believed she understood. And now, standing in the cold beside a stranger who had seen through her disguise, Clara Whitmore realized that the quiet knowledge she carried might be far more dangerous than anyone inside that saloon could imagine. The snow continued to fall over Red Hollow, soft and steady, turning the narrow street into a pale ribbon between dark wooden buildings. The lantern above Elias Boone flickered slightly as a cold wind moved through the gap between the saloon and the general store. Clara Whitmore stood with her shoulders drawn in against the chill, her thoughts moving far faster than the quiet winter night around them. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of other people's words in silence. Every careless sentence spoken in the saloon, every quiet conversation at the edge of a poker table, every secret whispered by men who believed the girl beside them could hear nothing at all. Now a stranger had stepped into her life and uncovered that silence with a single whisper. Elias Boone watched her carefully, but not with suspicion. His gaze held something steadier than that. Curiosity, perhaps, or patience. The kind of patience a man learns when he spends months alone in the mountains where the nearest neighbor might live 10 miles down a frozen trail. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice still low but steadier than before. If people inside that saloon knew the truth, everything in this town would change. Elias tilted his head slightly, as if considering the weight of those words the way he might study a distant cloud before deciding whether a storm was coming. "Then the question is why you have not said anything," he replied calmly. Clara looked down the quiet street where snow had already begun covering the wagon tracks from earlier in the evening. The town looked peaceful now, almost gentle beneath the blanket of winter. But she knew how quickly that calm could disappear once the wrong truth came into the light. Because some things are safer when they stay hidden, she answered. Elias Boone let the silence stretch for a moment. Somewhere behind the saloon wall the piano struck a louder chord, and the sound drifted faintly into the cold night. He followed the noise with his eyes for a second, then looked back at Clara. Secrets have a way of growing heavier the longer they stay buried, he said quietly. Clara gave a small nod. She understood that better than anyone. Every day she had listened while men in Red Hollow spoke freely around her. Some words were harmless. Others were not. Over time those words had formed a picture she could not ignore. She had heard arguments about freight wagons that never reached their destination. Heard nervous laughter when someone mentioned travelers disappearing along the North Road. And more than once she had heard her father's voice among those conversations, always a little too eager to change the subject. Clara drew a slow breath and lifted her eyes toward the dark hills beyond the town. The mountains rose like silent walls against the winter sky. Somewhere beyond them stood the cabin Elias Boone had mentioned, a place far from Red Hollow and the tangled web of quiet talk that lived inside its saloon. "You live up there?" she asked softly. Elias followed her gaze toward the distant ridgeline. "About 12 miles north," he said. "The trail climbs through cedar and stone before the valley opens." Clara imagined that path for a moment. Snow-covered, quiet, empty of the voices that had filled her ears for years. But the thought did not bring relief. Because she knew something Elias Boone did not yet understand. The things she had heard were not only about the past. Some of those conversations had spoken about tomorrow. And tomorrow, if no one stopped it, something important was going to happen on the road that ran through Red Hollow. Clara Whitmore kept her eyes on the dark road stretching north of Red Hollow while the snow continued falling in slow, quiet sheets. For a moment, she wondered whether she should have stayed silent the way she always had before, pretending the world did not reach her ears. But the thought faded quickly because the words she had heard earlier that evening were still echoing in her mind. Inside the saloon, long before Elias Boone walked through the door, two men had been speaking near the stove while the rest of the room focused on a card game. They had believed the girl beside the wall could not hear a single word. One of them mentioned a supply wagon scheduled to pass through the valley at sunrise, a freight wagon traveling from Carson Ridge with medicine, flour, and tools for the mining camps beyond the mountains. The other man had laughed quietly and said that wagons moved slower in winter, especially on the narrow road that curved along the frozen creek about 3 miles outside town. Clara had not looked at them while they talked. She had simply listened the way she always did, her hands folded, her face empty, letting their voices drift into the silent place where she kept every secret she heard. Now those voices returned as clearly as if the men were standing beside her again. Elias Boone noticed the change in her expression. The mountain man had spent enough years alone among the timber to recognize the moment when a thought turned from memory into decision. "You heard something important," he said quietly. Clara hesitated only a second before answering. "A wagon is coming through the valley tomorrow morning," she said. "A freight wagon with supplies." Two men inside the saloon were talking about it earlier. Elias studied her face carefully, the lantern light revealing the seriousness behind her calm voice. "That does not sound unusual," he replied. Clara shook her head slightly. It was the way they talked about it. They knew exactly where the road becomes narrow near the frozen creek. They knew the wagon would slow down there. Elias looked toward the hills again, picturing the trail in his mind. He knew that stretch of road well. The creek bent through a shallow canyon about 3 miles north, the path squeezed between rock on one side and tall pines on the other. In winter the ground turned slick with ice, and wagons moved carefully through the bend. They sounded like men planning something. Clara continued softly. "And one of those voices belonged to my father." The wind moved gently through the street, carrying the faint creak of a loose sign hanging above the saloon door. Elias Boone said nothing for several seconds. He understood now why the girl had spent years pretending to hear nothing. In a place like Red Hollow, careless talk could reveal far more than people intended. Clara drew her coat tighter around her shoulders as another gust of snow drifted across the lantern light. "If that wagon reaches the narrow bend tomorrow morning, those men will be waiting," she said. Elias Boone looked down the dark road leading out of town, the same road he had planned to take back toward his cabin in the hills. Somewhere beyond the trees the creek curved through the valley exactly where Clara described. The mountain man had lived long enough to recognize when a quiet piece of knowledge could change the course of a day. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Then tomorrow morning," Elias said slowly. "Someone needs to be standing on that road before the wagon gets there." Clara Whitmore watched the snow fall across the empty street of Red Hollow and realized that the silence she had used to survive for 3 years had just pulled two strangers into the middle of something far larger than either of them expected. The wind grew colder as the night settled deeper over Red Hollow, and the lantern outside the saloon swayed gently on its iron hook, throwing slow-moving shadows across the snow. Elias Boone stood quietly for a moment after Clara finished speaking, his eyes following the dark road that curved north toward the frozen creek. He knew that road well enough to picture every bend, even in the dark. 12 miles of mountain trail began there, climbing through cedar trees and narrow stone passes before reaching the small cabin where he spent most of his winters alone. But the place Clara described lay only 3 miles out, where the valley tightened and the creek ran beneath a thin sheet of ice. Wagons always slowed there. Horses had to pick their steps carefully on the slick ground, and the rock walls on both sides left little room to turn around. If someone wanted to stop a freight wagon without drawing attention from town, it would be the perfect place. Elias drew a slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs with the sharp scent of pine drifting down from the hills. "How sure are you?" he asked quietly. Clara did not hesitate. "I heard them clearly," she said. "They talked about the bend near the frozen water. One of them even said the wagon driver would not see anyone, waiting until it was too late." The words hung in the still night between them. Elias nodded slowly, not because he liked the thought, but because it matched the kind of careless planning men sometimes revealed when they believed no one important was listening. Inside the saloon the laughter rose again for a moment, followed by the dull thump of a chair scraping across the floor. The town carried on as if nothing important had been spoken under the lantern outside. Clara watched Elias carefully. "You could still leave," she said quietly. "Your cabin is north of here. By sunrise you would be miles away from Red Hollow." Elias Boone glanced back toward her with a calm expression that had been shaped by years of watching storms move across the mountains. "I could," he admitted. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Snow continued drifting through the lantern light, soft and patient, covering the footprints they had left on the boardwalk. Clara lowered her eyes again, almost expecting the stranger to turn and disappear into the dark road the way travelers often did in towns like this. But Elias Boone did not move. Instead, he stepped down from the boardwalk into the snow-packed street and looked again toward the hills. "A freight wagon carries more than boxes," he said after a moment. "It carries the work of people who spent months preparing it. Medicine for camps that cannot wait until spring. Tools for miners who need them to keep their claims alive. If someone stops that wagon, a lot of men will feel it." Clara looked up slowly. The mountain man's voice had not changed, but something in his tone carried quiet certainty. Elias brushed a thin layer of snow from the saddle of a horse tied to the hitching rail. The animal lifted its head and snorted softly, recognizing the calm touch of someone used to handling horses. "You said the wagon arrives at sunrise," he continued. Clara nodded. "That is what they said." Elias Boone checked the leather strap along the saddle and glanced once more toward the road leading out of Red Hollow. The night was deep now, but dawn would come faster than most people expected. "Then we have a few hours," he said. Clara felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. For 3 years, she had listened quietly while the town spoke around her. Tonight that silence had changed something. Now the knowledge she carried was sending 2 people toward the narrow bend in the frozen valley before the first light of morning. The horse moved steadily through the snow-covered trail as Elias Boone guided it north out of Red Hollow, the lantern light from the town fading behind him with every quiet step. Clara Whitmore rode just a few feet behind on the smaller mare he had untied from the rail beside the general store, the animal's breath rising in pale clouds beneath the dim winter stars. The road was little more than a narrow ribbon of packed snow now, winding between tall pines that leaned inward as if listening to the silence passing beneath them. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The sound of hooves pressing into snow and the soft creak of saddle leather filled the cold night air. Clara kept her hands steady on the reins, though her thoughts moved quickly. She had lived in Red Hollow her entire life, but had never traveled this road after dark. The mountains looked different at night, larger somehow, their black outlines rising against a sky dusted with distant stars. Elias Boone rode with the calm posture of a man who had followed this trail many times before. He did not rush the horse. Instead, he kept a careful pace, the kind that allowed the animal to move sure-footed across hidden patches of ice. After nearly half a mile, he spoke without turning around. "You do not have to come farther than the ridge," he said. "From there you could ride back before anyone in town notices you are gone." Clara watched the tall shadow of the mountain man ahead of her, the outline of his coat shifting gently with each movement of the horse. "If I turn back now, the same thing will still happen at the creek," she replied quietly. Elias nodded once, though she could barely see the movement through the darkness. They continued riding another mile, the road gradually narrowing as the trees grew thicker along the frozen valley floor. Snow muffled every sound except the slow rhythm of the horses. Clara realized something then that she had not expected. For the first time in 3 years, the quiet around her did not feel like a prison built from other people's lies. Out here the silence belonged to the mountains themselves. After a while the trail began to slope downward toward the creek Clara had heard the men describe. The air grew colder as the land dipped into the narrow bend where rock walls rose along both sides of the road. Elias Boone slowed the horse and lifted his hand slightly. Clara guided her mare beside him and looked ahead. Even in the dim starlight, she could see the pale line of frozen water running through the valley about 100 yards away. The road curved tightly beside it, exactly where a wagon would have to move carefully before continuing north. Elias studied the ground for a moment. Faint tracks crossed the snow near the bend, not fresh, but recent enough to show someone had passed through earlier in the day. He turned toward Clara. "If those men plan to wait anywhere, it will be here," he said calmly. Clara felt the truth of his words settle over the quiet valley. The narrow road left little room for a wagon to turn around once it entered the bend. Anyone standing there could stop the driver with nothing more than a raised hand and a confident voice. Elias guided the horse toward a cluster of cedar trees overlooking the road and dismounted. Clara followed a moment later, her boots sinking softly into the snow. The valley lay still around them, silent except for the faint whisper of wind brushing through the branches above. Dawn was still hours away, but both of them understood something important as they stood there watching the empty road. The knowledge Clara had carried in silence for years had brought them to this place long before the men from Red Hollow believed anyone would be waiting. The valley remained silent beneath the fading stars as Elias Boone and Clara Whitmore waited among the cedar trees overlooking the narrow bend of the frozen creek. Snow continued to drift slowly through the branches above them, settling across the road until the tracks they had followed were almost gone. Elias stood with his arms folded loosely against the cold, his eyes fixed on the pale curve of the trail below. He had learned long ago that the mountains rewarded patience. Storms passed, rivers froze and thawed, and travelers always appeared sooner or later along the same narrow paths carved through stone and timber. Clara stood beside him, her boots half buried in the snow, listening to the quiet valley with the same careful attention she had used for years inside the crowded saloon. The silence here was different from the one she carried in town. This silence held no lies. It simply waited. Time moved slowly in the dark hours before dawn. At one point the wind shifted, and the scent of pine drifted down from the ridge above them. The horses tied among the trees stamped gently now and then, their breath rising in white clouds. Elias glanced toward the eastern horizon where the sky had begun to lighten with the faintest shade of gray. "Not long now," he said quietly. Clara followed his gaze and felt the same mixture of tension and calm settling in her chest. Everything she had heard during the past 3 years had led to this quiet moment beside a frozen creek. Somewhere back in Red Hollow, the men who planned to stop the freight wagon likely believed the road ahead was empty. They believed no one knew their plan. That was the strange power of silence. People trusted it too easily. A faint sound reached them then, distant at first but clear enough for Elias to recognize immediately. The steady rhythm of wagon wheels moving slowly across packed winter ground. Clara heard it too. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked down the valley road. Far beyond the bend, A small shape began to appear through the pale morning light. Two horses pulling a covered freight wagon, their heads lowered as they worked carefully along the snowy trail. The driver sat bundled in a heavy coat, guiding the team with patient movements as the wagon approached the narrow section beside the creek. Elias watched the wagon for a moment before speaking. "They are right on time," he said softly. Clara felt the weight of the moment settle deeper. If the men from Red Hollow were still planning to wait here, they would arrive soon. But the road below looked empty except for the approaching wagon. The mountain man stepped forward slightly until he could see farther along the bend where the rocks curved around the frozen water. Fresh tracks had appeared in the snow since the night before, faint but visible to someone who spent most of his life reading the ground. Elias studied them carefully, then looked back toward Clara. "Someone came through here not long ago," he said. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. She followed the direction of his gaze along the narrow trail where the bend disappeared between the stone walls. For a moment, the valley remained still except for the slow approach of the wagon wheels. Then another sound drifted faintly through the morning air from somewhere beyond the curve of the road. The quiet murmur of voices carried by the wind, just low enough that most travelers would not notice them until it was far too late. The faint murmur of voices drifted again from beyond the curve of the frozen creek, carried by the cold morning air, just clearly enough for Elias Boone to recognize that Clara had been right. Someone was already waiting in the narrow bend ahead. Elias remained still among the cedar trees, watching the slow approach of the freight wagon while listening carefully to the quiet sounds rising from the canyon wall. Clara Whitmore stood beside him, her breath forming pale clouds in the growing light of dawn. The wagon driver had not yet reached the tight curve of the road, and from where he sat high on the seat, he could not possibly see the men hidden beyond the rock bend. Elias glanced once toward Clara. Her face was calm, but her eyes followed every movement on the trail below. For years she had heard secrets spoken in careless tones, and now those secrets had led them here. The wagon rolled closer, its wooden wheels turning slowly through the packed snow, while the two horses pulled patiently toward the narrow passage beside the creek. Elias studied the road one more time, then stepped quietly from the shadow of the cedar trees and moved down the short slope toward the trail. Clara watched him go without speaking. The snow muffled the sound of his boots as he reached the road and stood plainly in view of the approaching wagon. The driver noticed him immediately and pulled the horses to a gentle stop about 20 yards away. "Morning," the driver called cautiously, his voice echoing lightly off the stone walls. Elias lifted one hand in greeting. "Morning," he replied in the calm tone of a man used to mountain roads and early hours. The driver looked past him toward the bend ahead. "Trail clear?" he asked. Elias glanced toward the curve where the faint voices had come from earlier. The valley had grown quiet again, but he knew the men waiting beyond the bend were listening now. "Not exactly," Elias answered. The driver frowned slightly, shifting in his seat. "What do you mean?" Elias took a few slow steps forward until he stood beside the lead horse, resting one hand lightly on the animal's bridle. "There are men around that bend," he said plainly. The words drifted across the frozen creek and into the still air of the canyon. For a moment, nothing moved except the soft breath of the horses. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the bend, stepping cautiously into the open road. Another shape followed behind him, and soon two men stood visible between the stone walls, their coats pulled tight against the cold. They had expected an easy morning with a slow-moving wagon and a driver who knew nothing about the trap ahead. Instead, they found a mountain man standing calmly in the road and a freight team already stopped before reaching the narrow pass. The first man looked toward Elias with clear irritation. "You are standing in the wrong place, friend," he called out. Elias Boone did not raise his voice. "No," he answered quietly. "I believe I am standing exactly where I should be." Behind the cedar trees on the slope above, Clara Whitmore watched the scene unfold while the rising morning light spread slowly across the frozen valley. And for the first time, she realized that the silence she had carried for years was about to speak louder than anyone in Red Hollow had ever expected. The cold morning light continued spreading across the frozen valley as Elias Boone stood calmly beside the freight team, his hand resting lightly on the bridle of the lead horse. The two men beyond the bend studied him with growing impatience, their plan already unraveling in the quiet air of the canyon. The wagon driver remained seated above them, watching the exchange with cautious eyes while the horses shifted their weight in the snow. Elias did not move from the center of the narrow road. He knew the bend allowed little room for wagons to turn, but it allowed even less room for men who hoped to hide their intentions. The first man stepped forward a few paces from the rock wall, brushing snow from his coat sleeve as if the interruption were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You should move along," he said with forced patience. "This road belongs to travelers." Elias nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without stepping aside. "That is true," he replied calmly. "Which is exactly why I stopped this wagon before it reached the bend." The second man shifted behind the first, glancing toward the wagon and then back toward the mountain man standing quietly in the trail. Their easy confidence from earlier had begun to fade. Plans that depend on silence rarely survive once someone speaks before the right moment. Elias watched them carefully, the way a man might observe clouds gathering along a distant ridge before a storm. "The driver will continue north in a moment," Elias added. "But not until we are certain the road ahead is clear." The wagon driver leaned slightly forward from his seat. He had spent enough years hauling freight through rough country to recognize when strangers understood more about a situation than they first revealed. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked. Elias looked up toward him briefly. "Nothing that cannot end quietly," he answered. His voice carried just far enough for the two men ahead to hear every word. The first man glanced down at the frozen creek beside the road, then back toward the bend where the narrow canyon opened toward Red Hollow. For a second, he seemed to weigh his options. The morning light now touched the upper branches of the pines, brightening the valley enough that any traveler passing along the ridge might notice movement in the narrow pass below. Plans meant to unfold in darkness lose their strength once daylight arrives. From her place among the cedar trees above the trail, Clara Whitmore watched the scene with steady attention. She could hear every word drifting upward through the quiet air. The men below still believed the town remained asleep, unaware of their intentions. They did not know the girl who had spent 3 years listening in silence was now standing above them, her quiet knowledge guiding every moment unfolding in the valley. The second man finally spoke, his voice lower now. "There is no reason for trouble today," he said. Elias Boone nodded once more. "I agree." For a long moment the three men simply stood there while the wagon horses breathed slowly in the cold morning air. Then the first man stepped back toward the rock wall and lifted one hand in a gesture that carried more resignation than anger. The narrow pass suddenly felt much wider without the weight of hidden plans pressing against it. Elias waited another moment before turning his head slightly toward the slope above the trail. Clara understood the signal immediately. The silence she had carried for years had done its work. The road ahead was clear now, not because anyone raised a weapon or a shout, but because the truth had arrived before the wrong moment could take hold in the valley. The morning sun climbed slowly over the ridge above the frozen valley, spilling pale gold light across the narrow road where the freight wagon waited. The cold air still carried the scent of pine and snow, but something else had changed in the quiet canyon. The tension that had filled the bend only moments earlier had begun to fade like a shadow pulled back by daylight. Elias Boone remained beside the lead horse for a few seconds longer, watching the two men who had stepped away from the road. They no longer stood across the trail. Instead, they moved quietly along the edge of the rock wall, their boots crunching softly in the snow as they disappeared around the bend they had once chosen as the perfect place for an unseen plan. No raised voices followed them. No hurried footsteps. Just the slow sound of men realizing that the morning had not unfolded the way they expected. The wagon driver exhaled a long breath from his seat above the freight bed. "Well," he said after a moment, his voice steady but thoughtful, "that is not the kind of greeting I usually expect before sunrise." Elias glanced up toward him and gave a small nod. "Sometimes the road asks a man to arrive a little earlier than planned," he replied. The driver studied the mountain man for another second before giving a quiet chuckle. "Looks like you did exactly that." Elias stepped aside from the horses and patted the lead animal gently along its neck. The team shifted forward a half step, eager to continue the trail they had been following since long before dawn. "You should keep moving," Elias said calmly. "The road north will open wider once you pass the ridge." About 2 miles ahead. The driver nodded in agreement, gathering the reins in his gloved hands. With a soft call to the horses, The wagon rolled forward again, its wheels turning slowly through the snow as it entered the narrow bend that now stood empty and quiet. Elias watched until the wagon cleared the curve and continued safely along the valley trail. Only then did he turn his eyes toward the cedar slope above the road. Clara Whitmore stepped from the trees a moment later, her boots leaving light prints in the snow as she walked down toward the trail. For a long time she had lived in a world where silence meant survival. Now she stood beneath the morning sky, realizing that silence could also guide something better when the right moment arrived. Elias met her halfway between the trees and the road. For a moment neither of them spoke. The sun had climbed high enough now to warm the tops of the pines, and a faint breeze moved gently through the branches above them. Clara looked toward the bend where the wagon had disappeared. "It worked," she said quietly. Elias Boone rested his hands on his coat pockets and followed her gaze down the trail. "Truth has a way of clearing a road," he answered. They stood there for another quiet moment while the valley returned to its natural stillness. Somewhere far ahead, the wagon wheels continued turning toward the mining camps beyond the mountains, carrying medicine and tools that would reach men who depended on them. Clara finally looked back toward the distant direction of Red Hollow. The town would wake soon, and the voices inside the saloon would begin again like they always did. But one thing had already changed. The girl they believed could hear nothing had already shaped the course of the morning without saying a single word to them. Elias Boone turned toward his horse and loosened the reins from the cedar branch where he had tied them. Clara watched the mountains rising beyond the valley and felt something she had not known in years. Not fear, not silence, just the quiet understanding that sometimes justice arrived not with noise or anger, but with a simple decision to stand in the right place before the wrong moment had a chance to begin.